Hi, my name is Sofia and this is my Creative Critical. I am going to film this as a video and I have my presentation here. I will go through the slides so that it's easier to see the images that I'm referencing, and then I will elaborate based on what I want to talk about. So I'll be talking about the film Yinta, and I will be talking about the themes that are present in the film as well as the literary devices that lead into what I would like to state in my hypothesis. So an introduction to the film, just a quick introduction about what the film is about. This film spans more than a decade and it follows Frida Hewson and Molly Wickman as their nation reoccupies and protects their ancestral land from the Canadian government and several large fossil fuel companies around the world. The film is about the Wet'suwet'en people, Indigenous people, how they are trying to protect their land against the Canadian government and the RCMP that are trying to impede a construction of a oil and gas line on their land. They're trying to protect this land because they have the rights of their ancestors who have lived there for centuries. They feed off the land, they live off the land, and they are trying to make sure that there's no destruction of their land and their ancestry and their culture. But the RCMP and Canadian government believe that it is their right to be able to develop these pipelines, as Canada has a multi-billion-dollar oil and gas. My thesis statement for my Creative Critical is, in Yinta, imagery, juxtaposition, and visual rhetoric are used to depict the presence of police and governmental authority with the activism of the Indigenous peoples. So I will talk about the ways that visual rhetoric and juxtaposition and imagery are used to show the contrast between the government and police authority that is trying to be pushed onto the Indigenous people and their land, as well as the imagery, juxtaposition, and the visual rhetoric that is used in contrast to that to show both the history of the Indigenous people, the pushback from the Indigenous people against the Canadian government, as well as some of the imagery that creates a subtext to the film and leads a little bit more into the history as well as the political ambiance that adds to the film's themes. First, I would like to talk about imagery. There's a lot of imagery that is present in this film that is very symbolic of a lot of the subtext and the history that is present with the Indigenous people. So one of the largest imageries that is present in the film is that of the red dress. So the red dress is symbolic of the missing Indigenous women and girls who have been murdered or have gone missing over the past decades. But the color red is also symbolic of connection to ancestors, and it is also symbolic of the Indigenous bloodline. And you'll see a lot in this film that red is placed throughout the film to show when the Indigenous people are at their strongest, when they're fighting, when they want their cause to be heard. Even when the red colors or red dresses aren't depicted in an outright way, even if it's not intentional, the color red is really hard to miss in a lot of the scenes because it is placed specifically when the Indigenous people are fighting against the RCMP, when they are fighting against the government. And you can hear later on when I talk about juxtaposition, how these colors and these dresses are directly opposite of the scenes that are taking place between the government pushing in on the land, between the RCMP fighting with the Indigenous people, the certain people who are trying to keep them off of their land. So one of the biggest imageries you can see with the red dresses is in the blockade scene. So in the foreground of the blockade scene, you have the RCMP and the government trying to push over the bridge that the Wet'suwet'en people have blocked off, and they're not allowing these people to come in because, according to them, their rights allow them to protect their land, and it's basically trespassing if the RCMP and the government impedes on their land. So there's red dresses in the foreground to show the strength of the Indigenous people, as well as to force the RCMP and the government in a subtext to confront the reality of their government, to confront the reality of the police regime, because these dresses are indicative of so many of these missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the subtext of the film, you can see in a lot of the scenes, which I will go into in a little bit, how the RCMP and the Canadian government almost turn a blind eye to the imagery that is present within the film. So you can then see later on in the film, when the red dresses are hanging from the forest, the trees in the forest, they also have names on them. And they zoom in on these red dresses with the names of these missing Indigenous women and girls. And at the same time, you see these huge oil and gas trucks drive by, and you can really see how this imagery of the missing Indigenous women and girls is contrasted, it's juxtaposed with these trucks and with the government authorities that are coming onto land, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. The color red, I would really like to go in a little bit more depth on because it is quite subtle in the film. It is in the foreground, which you can see when the Indigenous peoples are wearing their colors, they're wearing their cultural garments. You can see it when the red dresses are hanging, and you can see it when they later on talk about the protests that happen within Canada and people are wearing red, they're showing red dresses. But it's really subtle when the film switches between clips of the government talking about impeaching the land. When the government talks about imposing on the land and putting the pipeline in, and they switch to the Wet'suwet'en people talking about their ancestors, talking about the importance of their land. As you can see here, she's wearing a red garment. This scene is directly after Justin Trudeau took the stand to talk about reconciliation, to talk about working with the Indigenous people. You can also see here, again, she's wearing a red vest. And Frida in a couple of scenes was also wearing a red vest after Justin Trudeau talked about making reconciliations with the Indigenous people, talking about how they should move past this kind of deep-seated pain that they have felt, although you can see by the representation of the imagery of the red right after that, how fresh it is for these people, how the government and the police try to dampen the real underlying subtext of decades of these people being denied their rights. So you can see it. You can also see it here on the bus when they've put a bus to block the bridge for the RCMP to come through to be able to remove people so that the oil and gas companies can come and build the pipelines. The bus is painted red. And you can also see more subtly here in the corner how there's one red dress hanging in the background of these people who are then walking through the land trying to protest against the RCMP. There's one more scene as well where there's two people who are sitting next to these huge machines that are used to bulldoze the land. And whether this be intentional or unintentional is unknown to me, but in the film, it's very subtle. You can see that they're sitting on red lawn chairs. So even in the scenes where they're not outwardly producing activism, outwardly yelling against the police, outwardly demonstrating their rights, you can see that there's always a subtle way that they are bearing themselves. There's always a way they are bearing themselves, and then the audience and the RCMP is bearing witness to them putting out a subtlety of that color that's indicative of all of these themes of their ancestries, of history, of politics, so forth. I would now like to move on to juxtaposition. So juxtaposition takes two forms in this film. It takes juxtaposition in sound and in visual. And there is a couple moments where there is a crossover between sound and visual. So you have one theme presented in a sound and one theme presented in visual. So as you can see here, this is the scene where the RCMP is forcing the Wet'suwet'en people off of the bridge. And in the scene, you have the calls of the ancestors being demonstrated by the Wet'suwet'en people. And juxtaposing that, you have the sounds of helicopters, you have the sounds of RCMP's boots across the ground. And you can really see that there's this contrast between the presence of police authority, government authority, and the activism that is portrayed by the Indigenous people. The sound almost overlays each other. In another scene, a truck, which I mentioned earlier, drives past these red dresses with the names of these murdered and kidnapped Indigenous women who've gone missing. And there's this truck that drives past, so you can see kind of the contrast between this activism that is happening and the blatant disregard for this land that is happening with the oil and gas companies, where the RCMP is, for lack of a better word, turning a blind eye to this atrocity. So there's a little bit of subtext of the history and the politics that's going on, as well as the blatant text that is happening with the imagery in the film as well. There's an imagery shift in that moment as well, because you go from this scene of tranquility of the forest with this dress, of this beautiful red dress of this woman who has gone missing or has been murdered. And there's a shift then in the sound with this ominous music that takes over as the trucks drive through. So it's very intentional when the filmmaker wants the audience to receive this as something that's positive and something that's negative, and they're being directly juxtaposed with each other. To talk a little bit about visual juxtaposition, there is multiple times when they're protesting where the Indigenous people will be sitting down, the Wet'suwet'en people will be sitting down peacefully protesting on the bridge, and there's fires that are going up around the bridge. You can hear guns being clanged against the ground, you can hear boots being clanged against the ground, but you can see all of this. You can see the fires going off, you can see the police charging, and then you, in the same scene, can see the Indigenous people peacefully sitting and protesting. On top of that, you can also see a lot of the RCMP in the background of the films, of the shots in the film where they have the red dresses. So to show a little bit of a visual, in this moment, you can see the red dresses that are hanging there as a sign of activism with the RCMP walking in the background. So you really are juxtaposing these ideas of these murdered and Indigenous women, which is a really, really sad and heavy topic for the people of this land, with this complete disregard for their history, for their ancestry, because of these people that are trying to basically push them off their land for financial gain. As you can see it here in this scene, and this is the scene where the dress was hanging and the trucks were driving by. You can also see here a sound and visual crossover with juxtaposition. So this was when one of the chiefs of one of the tribes was being arrested, and the cameraman asks him if he has anything that he would like to say. And he says, "I wish love to everybody." As there's also images of him and his members being shown, being arrested in a very forceful and aggressive way. So you're juxtaposing this line of peace and tranquility and love coming from this chief of this Indigenous tribe with scenes of brutal force that's being pushed upon them by the RCMP. I also think one of the most core juxtapositions that happens in this film is when all of the ancestral chants happen. They're chanting to the land, they're chanting to their ancestors, and there is helicopters that are flying above to announce to them that they're not allowed to be on their land, that they will be forcefully removed, that they are going against the impeachment that's being proposed by the Canadian government. So there's multiple scenes of Frida calling out to her ancestors, calling out to the land when she is being yelled at by the RCMP for being able to exercise her right to express her culture on her own. Lastly, I would like to touch on visual rhetoric. So the visual rhetoric that is present in this film is quite subtle, but I wanted to touch on it because it really leads the audience to a bigger cultural image, and it talks about a lot of the subtext, leads to a lot of the subtext that is discussed within the film. So at one point in the film, when multiple of the Wet'suwet'en people are talking about their ancestors and talking about how their ancestors were part of the residential schools, were part of the 60s scoop, where a lot of Indigenous children were taken from their homes and put into white foster care to then be able to be assimilated into Canadian Euro culture. That happened a lot for a lot of these people that are interviewed in the film. That happened to a lot of their ancestors. And residential schools, there was over 150,000 kids over the years that the residential schools were operating that were pushed into this, assimilating into Canadian culture and pushed out of their Indigenous culture. And unfortunately, many of those kids didn't survive, and a lot of them went missing. So to be able to demonstrate that in the film, there is black and white images when they're talking about times of oppression that are flashed on the screen. And you can see that when they're talking about the Indigenous communities in the residential schools, when they're talking about the 60s scoops, all the images are in black and white. Then when the dialogue shifts into the Indigenous communities talking about their activism, talking about their ancestors pushing back, talking about them pushing back, all the images come out in color. So there's this real tie between the visual rhetoric, juxtaposition, and imagery and symbolism in this entire film. So all of these literary devices seem to overlap seamlessly, and especially with the visual rhetoric, you can see it very clearly because there's a tie between the symbolic red color that is imagery in the film, that being then symbolic in the images that are shown for visual rhetoric, then also juxtapose the oppression with the activism. So it's a really, really cool way that it's overlapped to show how this government authority, how this police authority is pushed against the Indigenous activism. So to show it more visually, these two images in black and white are shown in the film when Frida is talking about how her ancestors were, her grandfather was pushed into a residential school, her ancestors were pushed into the 60s coup. Then this middle image. What's really, really key about this middle image in terms of showing this cultural underlie is that it's muted, but the one pinnacle piece of this image is red. There's a red hat next to this baby picture of her grandfather. Right after this image, there's then two images of her ancestors dressed all in their red garments. So you can see the shift from oppression, black and white image, slowly into talking about her grandfather, his place in her ancestry, and then into the Indigenous activism that took place and is now still taking place. So I want to conclude quickly by restating my thesis statement and talking a little bit about how these themes all tie into it. So my thesis statement is Inyinta imagery, juxtaposition, and visual rhetoric are used to depict the presence of police and governmental authority with activisms of the Indigenous peoples. So as I mentioned, there is symbolism that is tied into the imagery of the red dresses, the color red. You can see juxtaposition between sounds and images of the RCMP, the government, and the Indigenous people, their calls, the Wet'suwet'en people, their calls to their ancestors. And then you can see it really when they interview people individually to talk about their history, to talk about the oppression that they faced. You can see that in the visual rhetoric of the images. And all of this kind of ties into the subtext that I mentioned of the loss of their ancestry, the loss of their ability to be able to represent themselves, the push that comes from the RCMP, from the governmental authority. And that's all tied together within the film. Thank you so much for listening to my Creative Critical. I hope you liked it and have a great night.